Okay, I'm gonna kick us off. Really great to have you all here today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Bethan Laughlin. I'm going to be chairing this session today with our wonderful panel. We're having a tiny bit of trouble with some tech, but in the meantime, I'm going to take us through housekeeping. So just a few housekeeping notes for everyone. Here we go. So attendees, the people watching, are not going to have any access to microphones or cameras, but we're really keen for your questions. So if you just click the little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, you should be able to leave any questions that you might have. You can keep them anonymous or you can add your name, and we will do our best to answer them all for you. If you're having any technical difficulties, it's usually best to just try leaving and then rejoining using the same link. Sometimes Zoom can be a bit difficult. And we love your feedback. We're doing a series of these ZSL Talks events. So we're sharing a short survey at the end of the session and would love, if you've got time, to hear your thoughts on it. This meeting will be recorded, but don't worry if you're just watching at home. You won't be recorded, but you can watch this back on the ZSL Conservation YouTube channel that will be uploaded in the next couple of days. If you're on Twitter or X, as I now hate to call it, you can tag us and on the tags on the screen. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Great, so really wonderful to have you all here. This is our ZSL Talks event focused on putting nature at the heart of global decision making. We are joined by a wonderful panel. We've got Professor Nathalie Pettorelli from the Institute of Zoology. We've got Robin McKie, the science editor from The Observer, and finally we've got Heaney, a zoologist and wildlife presenter. And I'm Bethan Laughlin. I'm the senior policy specialist here at ZSL, doing a lot of our work on all things policy at both the domestic and the international level. And it's the international we're going to be talking about today. The way this session is going to run is I'm going to give us a quick fire tour of all things international policy and international climate and biodiversity policy, just to sort of set the scene a little bit, because for a lot of people, all these things can feel quite abstract, and I'm really keen that we try and give a little bit of a history in what we're doing, but that will only be about 10 minutes, and then we'll dive into discussion. And then the discussion will be Q&A format, where we'd love questions from you, but I also have some questions ready and waiting. The background to this session is that we're in the last decade or so, especially in the last few years, we've seen a huge amount of diplomatic change and successes and failures around how decision-making takes place around climate change and biodiversity action. And increasingly, we're seeing those two things being spoken about together, which is really important. But we also know that action is not yet taking place on the scale that it needs to. So this session is going to explore that through a multidisciplinary lens, because we've got a multidisciplinary panel. We've got scientists, science communicators, public engagement, we've got a bit of policy from me, and the idea is that we're coming at this from a variety of angles, so it's not just a boring policy discussion, which is what it can sometimes be. Great, so let's get started. So the language that I've found to be quite helpful in how we can understand the crisis we're in is thinking about it as a triple planetary crisis. So we're not just seeing climate change or biodiversity loss or pollution, we're seeing all three of them at the same time. And as such, they're requiring action. Now, policymakers have been very slow to take up the urgency, but they are increasingly acting and legislating around the urgency. That happens both domestically and also locally in a lot of cases, but it also happens globally. And in those global settings, these the change in the agreements takes place through something called multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs. In the world of the UN, there are far too many acronyms, and MEAs is one of them. But multilateral environmental agreements are really, really helpful, and there are lots of them. There's MEAs on everything from the regulation of mercury and other chemicals to the regulation of the trade of endangered species, through to everything in between. And for today, though, we're going to be looking at 2 MEAs, because even that is sometimes too many. We're going to be looking at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You may have heard of the Paris Agreement. That is under the UNFCCC. So United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC is the acronym. And then we've also got the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD. Now, these are 2 quite different conventions, but their aim is to try and get countries to agree that there's a problem and to act on that problem. But even getting agreement has been really, really difficult. And the history is actually super interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that timeline that we've seen. So we're going to go all the way back to the wonderful days of 1992. In 1992, there was a summit called the Rio Earth Summit. It had a much longer, boring name, which you can see at the top, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, but everyone knows it as the Rio Summit. And at that summit, 3 things were created, 3 conventions. We have the 2 I've just mentioned, the UNFCCC and the CBD. And then you've also got another one called the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, which is all about soil health and ensuring we can have healthy soil systems. The UNCCD is super interesting, but we're not going to have a ton of time to talk about it today. So I'm going to sadly leave it to the side for today. But these 3 conventions came into place, and then what was built on top of them came later. So let's start with the UNFCCC. We had a really rocky road to get to where we are now. In 1997, we had the Kyoto Protocol, and then in 2009, we had the Copenhagen Accord. These were both attempts to get countries to agree to act, to agree on the issue of climate change, to agree on how they can tackle it. The problem is that they both failed. They were both an unmitigated failure due to a variety of reasons, but in essence, countries just could not find a way to make them happen, so they didn't work. It was only till 2015, when the Paris Agreement was passed, that is the first and only ever successful agreement on climate change we've ever seen. It's not perfect, but it's all we've got. And my favourite fact about the Paris Agreement and how it was passed was that up till the Paris Agreement, no woman had ever been in charge of the negotiations. And then when the Paris Agreement was passed, there was a woman called Christiana Figueres, who's a hero of mine, who led the negotiations, and it got through. And I do think that's very cool. And then in 2021, we saw a passage of something that sounds rather dull. The passage of the rule book is actually really important, because what it symbolised was that the negotiations are over, that the countries have agreed that action needs to happen. They've agreed on the principles. Now it's time to act. And at the heart of the Paris Agreement are 3 core obligations. You've got limiting temperature rise. Many of you will have heard limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. 2, that countries will, what we call, ratchet and increase their commitments every 5 years. And 3, that climate finance and support will be given to developing countries. Now, these 3 things are highly contentious. At the moment, we're not doing very well. And we're going to talk about that in a bit later. But those are the 3 things at the heart of the Paris Agreement. If we go back to our little timeline and look at the CBD, we've got a similarly complex road. You had something called the Aichi targets, which were passed in 2010. And these were an attempt to build consensus and agreement on the need for action around biodiversity, around halting biodiversity loss, reversing it, protecting biodiversity and nature. The problem is they didn't work. Again, they are a failure. And that's for a few reasons. The main ones being that there wasn't enough political interest. 2, there wasn't enough money. That's a really central one. And 3, that there wasn't a monitoring and evaluation process in place. So countries couldn't really track how well they were doing. And what that meant is that none of these targets were met. But in an attempt to learn from our mistakes, countries got back together again to negotiate a new framework called, and again, an awful name, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. It's a terrible name. We're just going to call it the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, the GBF has a bit more than the three things the Paris Agreement has. It has, and this slide is a little bit overwhelming, so I apologise, but don't worry, we won't stay on it long. This is the GBF. And at its heart, there's two things I want you to think about. The first is we've got 4 goals, and then the rest is 23 targets. So the goals are about the outcomes, what we want to be and where we want to be by 2050. And then the 23 targets are about the actions we're going to take to reach those goals. So you can see we've got hugely varied goals and targets. We've got everything from pollution to invasive alien species to connectivity to technology to gender. But a really important one that was agreed, a really important central area, is in goal A, and that is around protected areas. And every country who signed up to this, which is all the countries in the world except for America, because America doesn't like the Convention on Biological Diversity, agreed to protect 30% of their land, freshwater, and seas for nature by 2030. It's what's known as the 30 by 30 commitment. So what it means is that all the countries on Earth, except America, have committed to that amazing and ambitious target. And we're going to come back to that soon. So we've got 2 conventions that have 2 different pathways, but at the end of both of them, you've got 2 agreements. You've got 2 conventions that have been signed by pretty much every country in the world. You've got frameworks for action. However, it's not really working, is it? Because we're in what's being known as the era of implementation. But we also know that implementation is not happening fast enough, and that the damage because of climate change and the damage to biodiversity is absolutely staggering. I'm going to give 2 examples of that, and then I'll bring us to a close and we can talk to our panelists. The first is, this is a screenshot of a part of a recent report that was published earlier in 2023 called by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a fascinating document. I can highly recommend reading it. It's a bit of a sad nighttime read, but I can recommend it. This is just a snippet, but what it shows, and I hope you can see it on your screens, is the risk of loss to species at different levels of warming. So you can see that at 1.5, if we keep in that Paris Agreement target, we're still going to see a really unfortunate and incredibly sad level of species destruction. But the higher we go, the more dangerous it goes. So if you look at 3 degrees, especially around the equator, you're looking at sometimes 80 to 100% loss of certain species, depending on these, according to these models. And then at 4 degrees, it's looking really, really scary. This is wild-scale destruction of habitats, of crop systems, of farming, all of these things. So that's one example of how interconnected these crises are, and how their solutions also need to be interconnected. And this is another. This is a data set and an indicator that ZSL creates. It's called the Living Planet Index, or the LPI. And it's a measure of what we call biodiversity abundance. So that's not just the number of species, but the number of individuals within species groups. And the most recent LPI shows us there's been an absolutely enormous loss of biodiversity abundance since 1970, 69%. It's obviously incredibly, incredibly sad, but also really worrying, because I've just made clear in that previous slide that we're risking losing huge amounts of biodiversity but in future levels of warming, but you can see here that we've already lost a huge amount. This is a little visualization of what the LPI looks like in a visual format. So this is average levels of abundance every year since 1970, and you can see that we're moving from green to grey because we're losing abundance. I'm going to end on a domestic example because we kept it super global, and I want to end on domestic. So I mentioned the 30 by 30 target. So that's 30% of land, sea and freshwater protected for nature by 2030. Well, the UK has also signed up to that, and it's not going well, because what you can see here is that if you look at, so this, I should explain this report. This report was compiled by Wildlife and Countryside Link, which is a coalition of NGOs of which ZSL is a member. And there's an annual assessment of our progress towards 30 by 30 every year. And this is the one that was published just a couple of weeks ago. And it's showing that on land, only 3% of our land is what we call effectively protected. And in water, it's only 8%. So it's at sea, I should say, not in freshwater. So what this means is that even though areas might be designated as a national park or as a site of special scientific interest, if it's not being monitored, evaluated, funded, looked after, it's not necessarily going to be an effective place for nature. It's not necessarily going to be somewhere where nature can thrive. So this is an assessment that's incredibly worrying, but it does show how important domestic implementation is. If we think back to those two slides, the one on the Paris Agreement, the one on the Global Biodiversity Framework, that show what we've promised, this is a demonstration that we're not implementing well enough. And it's that implementation that I personally find super fascinating. And we're going to spend the rest of this session talking about with our panel. We're going to talk about how do we think we can understand why this is happening, why we just can't seem to implement, and what some of the solutions are. So with that, I'm going to bring us into our panel discussion. I'm hoping, Robin, your tech is back. I can see you, which is wonderful. Hello.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. That's great.
Oh,
Thank you so much for being here.
Just so that people know who I am, my name is Robin McKie. I'm the Observer's science editor, and that's a job I've held for the last 41 years. Now, there are various adjectives you could use to describe a tenure like that. Some of them not complimentary, but I like to think of myself as a veteran, if nothing else. So I'm a veteran science editor, and I've been through this sort of thing. Well, no, I haven't been through this sort of thing. This is the crucial point. I've witnessed some astonishing developments as a science editor, Human Genome Project, the battle against specific types of cancer, the development of the mobile phone. All astonishing things, but in the background, pushing itself forward further and further until it has really become the foreground. Have there been the changes that have occurred in the planet in the 40 years that I have been doing this job? We were 4 billion people on Earth when I started. There's now 8 billion. The world was 1 degree Celsius cooler than it is today. Now it's melting. And of course, there has been the loss of habitat and the loss of animal life. I've casually kind of worked it out as it seems to fit with what you were saying. About 50% of the planet's mammals, fish, and reptiles have been eradicated all the time that I was science editor. Now, there's nothing new in these statistics, but there is a couple of points worth noting from my perspective as a journalist, as a science editor, competing with other stories that go on the front pages and the other parts of the newspaper. Other crises have happened, such as AIDS, and that was one of the very worrying examples that I came across, not about the disease, but the way in which people responded to it. It's Isaac Asimov once said that if faced with a problem, the easiest solution to a problem is to deny there is a problem. And that was the first time that I really noticed that denial was it was becoming a kind of easy option. And of course, it's become easier and easier. And climate change denial and its impact on biodiversity, I take them both as very closely linked, is perhaps the most critical, damaging aspect of this whole affair. It's ground to a halt in some cases, in the sense that because it's now inescapable that we are undergoing the worst effects and impacts of climate change, from melting ice caps to wildfires. The deniers are still out there, though. How do we deal with them? And that is really the problem that I face. I can go on till I'm blue in the face saying, this is awful, this species is going to die next week. And eventually people will stop listening to me. They'll just say, oh God, it's all doom-monger again. And this is a narrative for us all. How do we keep a sense of an alarm but still pose elements of hope in an increasingly not hopeless situation, but in a situation where hope is decreasing, I suppose. And how do we balance alarm with hope? I think that's the message for any journalist interested in this today.
Thank you so much, Robin. That's a wonderful introduction. Just to pull out a little bit of what you said there, I think we'll talk about this more when we come into the discussion with the other panelists, but that thought of hope and action and stopping paralysis. Do you think there is like lessons to be learned within journalism around how that line can be tread?
Well,
or is it something that we're constantly learning about?
I mean, I think journalists should always be learning. I think part of the problem is that journalism itself is changing. Paid for journalism is decreasing. More and more people are getting their news from the social media, and that is really bad because at the end of the day, if I don't produce what I'm supposed to produce, they'll get rid of me. But if people are not really sourcing their journalism, which is what's happening increasingly today, we have problems. So there is the journalistic aspect to this that's journalism's own problem. And do other journalists? Most of the journalists I know are work for paid newspapers, Times, Guardian. They're all very honest, decent people, but fewer and fewer people are buying newspapers.
Thank you so much, Robin. We'll come back to that later when we come to the Q&A. But for the moment, I'm going to pass on to Nathalie for your little introductory spiel. Nathalie is a professor at the Institute of Zoology, which is the research arm of ZSL. She's an expert on climate change ecology, satellite monitoring, sensing, conservation technology, and has a wide-ranging expertise in rewilding and a range of other areas. But I will let you introduce yourself, Nathalie. Please, go on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bethan. Yes, so I thought it would be also quite helpful to explain how I got and ended up sitting in panels like this. So when I started in ecology 20 years ago, most of the scientists that were looking at the impact of climate change on wildlife were really looking at reporting how climate change was impacting species, movement, survival, reproduction. And as we have been going through the past 2 decades, we have really seen a shift in the type of approach and question that ecologists have been dealing with. For example, we started by really looking at the impact of climate change on species. Now we are really looking at also how wildlife, not only species, but ecosystem can really help adapt and mitigate to the impact of climate change. We started at talking about forest. And so when we think about nature-based solution and that link between the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, it was already something quite key to the Kyoto Protocol through the REDD and REDD+. So this is not new. What has been really interesting is seeing the shift in really starting to think beyond forest and also to start to really think about ecosystem as an entity of biodiversity that needs to be managed. It's been quite interesting to move from that species-based approach to that more ecosystem-based approach, at least through my career, because it has also enabled a lot of discussion in conservation in terms of the relationship between nature and people, and this relationship between the nature crisis and the climate change crisis, really starting to position the nature recovery as an important way to deal with the climate change crisis, something that we see now with this term of nature-based solution that has been popping up in the Glasgow Pact, and that is also referred to in the global biodiversity framework. So this is really where I sit. I think I'm coming at this with an ecologist background, so really thinking about the implementation of those type of solutions and to which extent it can actually work, to which extent also it will actually benefit both biodiversity and climate change mitigation and adaptation, making sure that there are safeguards so that we don't push a lot of solutions that may be beneficial for carbon sequestration but devastating for biodiversity. I've also done quite some work on trying to think about different ecosystem and how that crisis plays out. And so last year, for example, I was leading a report on urban rewilding, where we started to really talk about how nature recovery doesn't need to be happening far away, but also need to happen where we live. And that's because that's a place that will be particularly vulnerable, cities, to climate change, and where there's a lot to gain from nature recovery from an adaptation perspective. So I think that's how I ended up there. Through the years, I've developed a huge interest in policy globally, as you can see, and this is probably why, but also nationally, and thinking about how those big discussion, international discussion, play out nationally. So, for example, I've been doing quite some work on the Climate and Emergency Bill, which is basically a translation of that idea of tackling together the biodiversity and climate crisis, but played out in a national context. So how do you put together a legally binding world government approach to really tackle together those challenges? And I think that's where I sit today and nowadays.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nathalie. Yeah, that's great. The way you come at this from is just such a valuable entry point. I think I'm really interested. We can talk much more about this when we get into the Q&A, but I'm curious, you mentioned about how we can bring nature action and climate action together in a way that doesn't damage biodiversity. Can you just explain that a little bit more for those who might not be aware? Thank you.
Yes. So if you think about any kind of ecosystem, so let's think about mangrove, forest, grasslands, and they have different capability of sequestering and storing carbon. And so if you were to think just about nature to capture and store carbon, you would privilege some ecosystem over other. And therefore, you might get rid of a lot of grassland just to put trees everywhere, which is the famous let's plant tree all the time. But the problem is that there's important biodiversity in grassland. And that's just thinking about sequestering carbon, so carbon mitigation. It doesn't think at all about adaptation. And so when you're trying to think about those nature-based solutions, it's really important first to realize that you're not going to get out of the climate crisis with just nature. You first need to decarbonize a lot, and nature recovery can help, but it's not a replacement for decarbonization. But two, also, it's really about understanding that the climate change is happening. We're already seeing it all the time. So this is not just about sequestering carbon. It's also about adapting to what's coming. And so biodiversity has a big role there. And it's not just about tree. And so this is where those safeguards for nature-based solution implementation are really important, to make sure that people don't go on a one-sided vision, completely getting rid of things that we really need, or being more damaging than only focusing on the climate crisis, when biodiversity in itself is really important to humankind. So even if we didn't have a climate change crisis, the biodiversity crisis is a really big one, because we rely on all of nature for anything from clean air to water purification to food provision. So that's really where it can go wrong.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's I was in a meeting just early this week where the talk about how do we understand the economic value of nature came up, and there's a report that was published a few years ago called the Dasgupta Review, which estimated that about 55% of global GDP is reliant on nature, and more recent studies are showing it's actually probably far higher than 55%. And so even from a pure economic perspective, there's enormous value in integrating not only our work to decarbonize, but also our work across investing in nature as a tool, but a tool that basically doesn't just plant monocultures of one type of tree, which Nathalie put beautifully. Right, last but certainly not least, I'm going to hand over to Billy. So Billy Heaney is a zoologist, a wildlife presenter, and a filmmaker who is featured on BBC Countryfile, Radio 4's Nature Table, and is a regular presenter on Nina Constable's Media Wild World. Very excitingly, his film In Search of a Killer Whale was shortlisted in the adventure category of the Wild Film Fest in 2017, and is an all-round amazing wildlife communicator and nature communicator. So Billy, over to you, please.
It's a hard one to follow. Thank you very much, Bethan. So yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me. So as you sort of touched on there, my name's Bill. So I'm a zoologist on paper. I studied at the University of Exeter, and I sort of did my undergrad down there and my postgrad research. So my main research as a zoologist was using camera technology to monitor wildlife populations, but particularly looking at pinniped haulouts around the Cornish coast. So my main zoological background is with marine vertebrates. And my research with that sort of took me around the Cornish coast, looking for seal pups in the Isles of Scilly and around the mainland as well. But I spent a lot of time looking at turtles in the Mediterranean, and led me into becoming a tour guide as well as doing the research side of things. I've worked on boats around the world looking for marine wildlife. But since finishing my studies, I've kind of got more into the digital communications aspect and angle of this. I'll touch on the broadcasting in a minute. It's still very early days for me with the broadcasting side of things, but ZSL has been playing a very key part in that. So thanks again, guys. But as a digital communicator, by day, I've been working for the Wildlife Trust for the past 3 years. I've recently left, but I was working in Gloucestershire for the Wildlife Trust. And that led me to sort of learn a lot of skills within science communication within the charity sector, and enabled me to sort of use my filmmaking perspective to educate and raise awareness for a lot of interesting topics, touching on what Robin and Nathalie have been talking about with nature-based solutions here on a local scale, from what's been going on in the county that I live in, to wildlife reintroductions and the success of those. So one of the most exciting ones was the pine marten reintroduction that's happened here in the Forest of Dean, to match up with the Welsh reintroduction that took place back in 2015, 2016. And that's kind of a double-edged sword for me, because it's the pine martens that I talked about on Countryfile, and then we've also done some more stuff with this from the Wildlife Trust itself. By getting to talk about a species reintroduction, to talk about the bigger picture with a landscape scale approach, was really exciting. And one of my particular favourite topics here was the reintroduction of the large blue butterfly into our grasslands here. And we've now got the biggest population anywhere in the world here in Gloucestershire, which is 10 minutes from my house, and there's also a very nice pub. So if you're going down there, there's a nice walk to do it, and have a cheeky pint afterwards. But as well as sort of talking about the really sort of species, the sexy stuff, a lot of part of my job was talking about this 2030 target as well. So it's sort of trying to bring those bits to life that are harder to visualize. So part of my job was sort of talking about that on the science communication perspective. But outside of that, my skills are within the broadcasting world. So yeah, I've been working with ZSL and Radio 4 on the Nature Table. And this was quite a fun way of having a comedy perspective to talk about wildlife and the threats currently facing our wildlife and climate change around the world. And obviously Sue Perkins does that effortlessly. So working on that program has been fantastic. And with Countryfile, that was the Pine Marten project. And then more recently this year, I've been sort of, my main passion is marine mammals and whales and dolphins. And I've been featured on ITV this morning, and I've got a program going out on BBC World Service about the interactions that we're seeing between orcas and boats in the Iberian Gulf at the minute, which is a very interesting topic, and a whole can of worms which we don't need to get into in this, but sort of a lot of my communication has been species led rather than grander scale. But within that, I've sort of been working with other charities, sort of raising awareness for different conservation topics that are really close to my heart. Been recently teaming back up with the Badger Trust with their State of the Badger report and everything that's been going on with mustelids and badgers around the UK. But a lot of my work with sort of raising awareness and petitioning has been with whale and dolphin conservation about bycatch in UK seas. And it's also all sorts of those other things as well. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
That's splendid. Thank you, Billy. Yeah, really great. I think your perspective of how do we communicate about these complex topics, I mean, you and Robin both share that that perspective of that difficulty of communication, but I imagine in a format that is as tight as TV, in trying to express that must be particularly difficult. I wonder, like, what's the process for that when you're like trying to work through how do you make this accessible but also as fact-based as possible?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, at the minute we're seeing with broadcasting, but for me, I've been a contributor as opposed to a leading sort of broadcaster. So I've always been sort of included as a sort of side piece to sort of maybe bring in expertise in a particular area. But what we're seeing with especially wildlife and science, natural history broadcasting at the minute is budget cuts. So at a time where we need more and more stories to be going out, we're seeing less and less commissioning, which is, and I was speaking to a producer the other day, 3/4 of freelancers are currently out of work. So it's a really tricky thing to crack at the minute when we need more exposure and accessibility to these conversations when there's just not the work and the resources to put them together.
Thank you. I think you might also have a fellow nature tabler in Nathalie as well, because Nathalie, do I remember you were on Nature Table with Sue Perkins, or am I mistaken?
Yeah, but that was a very short moment.
No, it was great. It was really good. I remember listening in, especially. It was in the workday and we all tuned in. It was wonderful. No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Billy. We're gonna zoom in a bit more on all things communications soon, because now we're going to move into the Q&A segment. If just a little push for anyone in the audience who might have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A function at the bottom. We're so keen to hear all your thoughts. It'd be amazing. But to kick us off, while people in the audience get brave enough to write some questions, I'm going to kick us off with a question to everyone. So maybe just like a couple of sentences of an answer. So we've outlined here in this conversation and also in the little presentation at the beginning that like we need a lot of action to take place, and that it's not happening. So a quick fire question for you all, which is a bit of a cheeky question really, but what do you think, from your perspective and where you come at this from, what's one change that you think needs to take place to really mobilize action? Now, obviously, there are many, many changes that need to take place, but I'm really eager to hear it from the communication side, from the science communication side, from the science side. What do you think are those pivotal changes that need to take place? I'm going to be cruel and just pick Nathalie to go first, and then we'll just go around. Thank you.
Legally binding. So that's would be one thing that I would pick up. We have no legally binding framework for biodiversity. We have, especially in the UK, there's a lot. There's been some apex target for biodiversity, but we're really globally we're missing on those teeth for forcing action, and that I think, especially in the biodiversity part of those crises, where people this is a crisis that is less there's less funding going towards addressing it. There's no legal binding agreement to enforce it, and it's generally not perceived as of an emergency as the climate one, even though it's exactly as important as that. So yeah, the one thing I would change is to get legally binding instruments for biodiversity.
Yeah, that's such an important point, because something I didn't mention at the beginning that's vital is that neither the Paris Agreement or the Global Biodiversity Framework are legally binding. They're all done on political promises, and that's what makes implementation so difficult. There's very few treaties where there are legally binding requirements. There's a few, but they're far outnumbered by those that don't have that. And then you've also got non-legally binding commitments domestically as well. So super important that we start integrating in, like we've got the Climate Change Act, which is in theory designed to legally commit us, but we even saw just last week that the commitments made are being rolled back in the UK. So really important point. I'm going to point Billy, go on next. What's your one thing?
I think for me, it's just being bolder. And I've seen this sort of happening in the last couple of years. We haven't been working within the charity sector, but also seeing stuff from a broadcasting perspective, is getting bolder with what we're communicating to wider audiences. I think documentaries aren't quite as bold as they could be and should be in prime time television. So I think that's something that would be nice to see. We are getting those snippets where they are getting bolder towards the end, but all that messaging needs to be steered throughout the narrative, and NGOs are getting there, but I feel like there's still more room to grow with that.
Awesome, thank you. And Robin?
I was going to go back to what Nathalie said. Totally agree with that. And particularly what you said on the domestic side of it. We've seen a week in which just about every climate, not promise, but a great many climate promises have been watered down. We are just not committing ourselves. We have to do it nationally first, and then maybe we can then sign up to something internationally. But at the moment, Britain is pathetic as you can get, and there's not much influence to have when we're that pathetic. So I think we need it's interesting. I haven't been following the Labour Party conference that much today. Other things I haven't seen the word climate really bother many people there, which I find deeply depressing. So I think a lack of political commitment and a change in that attitude is what we need.
It's really interesting because around party conferences, you're seeing so much on the fringes, like in fringe events around climate, but how it's permeating, even at Conservative Party conference, there is interesting conversation. It's not enough, but we're just not seeing it permeate onto the stage in the level that necessitates when we understand the scale of the crisis. So really, really good. Thank you so much, Robin. We're seeing questions come in and I'm going to go through them, but I want to just hit something towards Nathalie as a question to kick us all off. Your work is all around the intersection between biodiversity, ecology and climate, and I'm just really curious to hear your thoughts on what are the benefits that bringing climate and nature action together can bring. You mentioned adaptation before, and I'd really love if you could just talk a little bit more about those benefits, because we're always talking about the risk of the losses, and those are of course severe, but I do think it's important we touch a little bit on like what could we gain from this. Thank you.
I think to understand that, you really need to appreciate how those crises are intertwined. So on one hand, you have climate change impacting species and ecosystem in terms of extinction risk, in terms of distribution. You get species moving around trying to track climatic condition. You get things trying to adapt. You get things struggling to access their prey, things struggling to reproduce. So a big driver of biodiversity loss is climate change. But then the other way around goes exactly the same, which is as you lose nature, you're losing one opportunity to sequester and store carbon, because all those peatlands, all those mangroves are really good at doing that. And then as you degrade your peatlands and your mangroves, you're also releasing more carbon in the atmosphere. So you're making things worse. So I think most scientists that work in this arena would tell you that you cannot solve one without the other. So it makes total sense to tackle them jointly. But making sure that there are safeguards around that, which is the things that we have talked about before. In terms of those co-benefits, I find that really important, because you get a lot of narrative around, oh, we'll get out of the climate change crisis with technology. Don't worry, we get those big things that will do incredible stuff. One, it's mostly unproven technology. Two, it's extremely costly. Three, we have something that works already. It's been trial and tested for millions of years. It's called nature. It's doing really great. Fourth, those technological developments do not provide co-benefits. They don't help with adaptation. They give you anything about helping when there's a heat wave, there's a flooding, or there's a drought. So it makes absolute sense to think about nature recovery when you're thinking about climate change, and the other way around. And so those co-benefits, they can be with water retention and change of flow during floods. We just got 38 to 39 degree temperature last summer. My kids couldn't go to school. The school was shut down. It was from 10 a.m. you couldn't go out. In that moment, you really realize the importance of having woods and trees, because it decreased by 10 degrees straight away. This is the kind of stuff that nature do. It really buffers you to against some of those extreme natural events. And these are the co-benefits that nature recovery can bring. So this is why there is so much push by the scientific community, both in climate and biodiversity, to try to work better together.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Before we dive into the next question, does anyone else want to add to that? But I have a question for you, Robin.
I was going to answer the point. I totally agree that we mustn't think that technology will get us out of this hellhole that we're creating for ourselves. But don't and a lot of people, a lot of deniers will say, oh, technology tomorrow, some magic stick will happen. I totally agree with Nathalie that that is not going to be the case, but I still think we need technology. We are still going to have to get we're going to have to get carbon out sequestered. We're still going to need these forms of technology. We still have to develop them. They will stop global warming getting worse, going into the 4 degrees. It might hold us back to 3 degrees. So I would just put a little kind of cautious word in here for the technologies that we will still need in the long-term future, but nature is the answer. I do agree with that.
I think it's also about what we choose to do first as well. Like if companies are saying, oh, we can invest in carbon capture and storage and CCS, the way they're doing it right now is as an excuse so they can keep producing oil and gas. So
yeah, and we had a golden opportunity to go ahead with carbon sequestration in this country 15 years ago, and we blew it, and we've wasted 15 years. So yes, I agree. That's another reason not trusting technology as a solution, because it can go as easily downhill as the HS2 or something like that.
Let's not get started on HS2. But I think it's a really, the points on the co-benefits around nature as an adaptation tool, I think, are so important, because it brings so many additional benefits to not only a survivable life, but a thriving one for people. So thank you, Nathalie, for that. On the topic of misinformation, Robin, I am curious about, you've seen the expansion of climate change and biodiversity loss as a topic over the course of your career, but you've also seen misinformation rise exponentially. I'm wondering, this is a difficult question, but as a science editor, how do you see the media's role in shaping policy and shaping public opinion on these topics? And just to pull out a question that was raised in the chat and in the Q&A, someone was really pleased to see you talk about hope and the need to keep hope. What do you think the role of journalism is in that bringing hope back into the picture?
I'll answer that last part of the question first, if you don't mind. I mean, I think that's the crucial point. It'd be all too easy to say, and things look really grim. The scenarios that you were outlining at the beginning look absolutely appalling. We're nowhere near going to keep it down to 1.5 at 2 the way we are going. It looks far worse. It would be all too easy just to give up and say, oh, well, sorry, we'll just see what's happening. And that really would suit the climate change deniers. That would suit them. They would just say, we can go ahead and keep on doing what we want to do. There is no global fiscal responsibility involved in this. So I think journalists, as much as politicians, have got to say, there is still hope, and I still believe there is hope. I certainly don't think the position is hopeless, but I do think it's difficult, and it's getting more and more difficult as time goes on. All the more reason to be careful about what I write. And that is not, as I going back to what I said at the beginning, not just going alarm, this is horrible, this species is gone, this whole ecosystem has got no chance of surviving, without sort of pointing out, well, we could save it if we did this, if we act now. So it's the journalism has to come with hope. It mustn't be hopeless. I forgot what the other part of the question was.
It's beautifully answered, but what's the role, how do you think the role of journalism, what is the role of journalism in that shaping of public and political opinion, and also how's it changing as well?
That's a very good question. I mean, there is no bigger story than this. I mean, science is a process of experimentation, and we are undertaking the biggest experiment of all time on our own planet. And I've got a ringside view in it. And I got to say, a lot of my colleagues have done very well, but there are certain colleagues who have not done very well. And there are still people writing climate change denying nonsense out there. I'm not going to give them the oxygen of publicity, but it's still there. I don't think it's anywhere as bad as it used to be, say, 10 years ago, for the simple reason it's now palpably obvious that the planet is in trouble, and climate change and its corresponding biodiversity loss is on us now. So, yeah, I would say, judging particularly by newspapers, that the better than they were, say, 10, 15 years ago, but there are still wretched little rags like the Spectator, and other things like that, who don't agree.
Thank you, Robin. Billy, I am really curious about, you work a lot in public awareness, engagement, and coming back to that communications point. How do you think the public can be encouraged to be a part of the solution? And what do you think is needed in that? We've had some questions in the chat that are similar to that, like what's the role of local people and how can they play a role? So I was curious about that from your perspective.
Yeah, nice. I think when it comes to like a public perspective, we've got to start small. And I think one good thing that lockdown showed everyone was the nature on our doorsteps and that nature connectedness, that we all thrived. And that, you know, for me, I was unemployed at the time, and it was like that my local woodland was my oasis and my escape every day. So I think when it comes to raising awareness, we got to start in our own back garden, and what we can implement in our own green space can help, you know, combined with nature reserves all over the UK, with, you know, teaming us all up, hitting these 2030 targets. We have most of the green space in the UK is now gardens and farmland. And that's where we need to be making these sort of small changes that we can incorporate into our daily lives. But with citizen science as well, you know, recording the species that you see in your doorstep, getting involved with citizen science campaigns like the RSPB, Big Garden Birdwatch, and the Big Butterfly Count as well, that the, say, Butterfly Conservation run, and you know, Shore Search. There's all these different citizen science campaigns which we go into more detail on, which you can start small or in your local area. But you know, from anything from avoiding peat-based composts, keeping your gardens chemical free, all of those little things that you can do and change into your green space or local area, that can then combine with the work of the National Trust, the Wildlife Trusts, Plant Life, you know, on a bigger, making one great big connected nature reserve.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, Nathalie, come on.
Yeah, I just want to add to this, because I don't want people to forget that the one thing they can do is to demand better from their leaders by voting and by really making it clear what are their priority. So it shouldn't be the government's failing, therefore we're trying to fix it. We do need a world government approach to this, which means we need to have the right people in charge making good decision for our future. And that happens when we vote and when we are clear on what kind of leadership we want. And so that's something that everyone can do.
Yeah, it's an unbelievably important point, especially as we're in the UK, as we're in the run up to an election, and then also globally, there's a huge amount of work to be done. There are lots of questions around this topic in the chat around how can we make change happen, and what's the role of political leaders, and also like in the news around the government's decision in the last few weeks to roll back on their timelines for their commitments. And there was one question that I noticed around how is it being perceived by other NGOs and around the world. And I think I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm curious about the other panelists, that the UK is in no way perfect for how it's been acting, especially not at the moment. But we were the first country in the world to have a climate change act. And it feels like now we're really slipping back into something where we're no longer a leader. We're barely even a follower, it feels to me at least. And I feel like we've got a huge way to go in really striving for not just the vital work of decarbonisation, which is absolutely central, but also, as Nathalie's put so beautifully, those co-benefits and bringing nature and biodiversity into our urban areas, into our rural areas, as a way of improving lives. This isn't just a matter of like when people can drive their petrol cars till. We're talking about a much wider set of problems. Happy to talk about other questions, but if anyone has any thoughts on that, building on Nathalie's point, please fire away. No? Cool. Next question. Robin, no, please, if you want to, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I totally agree with Nathalie.
Yeah. It's good. I think we're all on the same page. Yeah, I think to Robin, maybe actually to everyone, because I think we're moving into this topic, is that leaders have come together to make agreements, but it's obviously that the barriers are really strong against action. I'm curious about, from your 3 different perspectives, what do you think some of those key barriers are? Now, they might be as massive as, political uninterest, or corruption and all around the world. Obviously, different countries have different responses, but I'm just curious about what you think the key barriers are. I'll go to everyone, so just open up.
I suppose the immediate problem is that climate change affects every nation in a very, very different way, and therefore the politics of how it affects Britain, they're not so immediate as the politics that say affect Brazil or Central Africa. So it's very much an individual thing, which makes it all the more difficult for people to come to international agreements when people have got different agendas. The problem is that we're dealing with a political system that induces change with every 4 or 5 years when something that we need to have a coherent policy that lasts decades, which is not a solution. It's just another way of me reiterating the problem. But it shows that, I think, your question underlines the fact how very, very difficult it is.
Thank you.
So I think that this is an easy put together question, which goes into a massive complex problem. so there are different reasons for inaction on the climate front and on the biodiversity front, and then there is different level of reason for inaction depending on where you're looking at globally. So if you think about biodiversity in action, I would say that there are a number of drivers which have to do with money, first of all. So for the moment, there is nowhere near enough funds directed to nature recovery, as opposed, for example, to climate change mitigation and adaptation, but climate change mitigation. You don't have that Paris-style agreement in nature. You do have a global biodiversity framework, but it's still seen as weaker in terms of commitment than something like the Paris Agreement. And there is a difference in really picking up on the emergency. And to some extent, that has to do with how the biodiversity crisis took much more time to be qualified as a crisis. And that's because when the UNFCCC was created, very quickly we had an international panel on climate change, which brought all those scientists and brought the evidence as quickly as possible to the government. With biodiversity, it took forever to actually get an international panel for biodiversity and then put the evidence. And really the big moment was, I would say, in 2019 with that big biodiversity report by the IPBES, where it was very clear cut that this was a big emergency. So there's been a delay in time. So when you're thinking about those drivers, they are different from both. And then, as Robin was saying, depending on where you are and depending on which crisis you're looking at, inaction can be quite different. So if you think at countries that have to completely remodel their energy model to try to tackle climate change versus some that are maybe smaller, have less people, or are already made the technological advancement, depending on their reserves and their ability to invest to do those transformations, that can be a big hard job. Not all countries have the same budget and face the same constraint. With biodiversity, you also have this problem of some countries are completely used to live without biodiversity. The UK is a perfect example. It's one of the most nature depleted country in the world, and most people think that there's still too much nature. so there's some people that still struggle with the weeds, with those species that they don't like, those mosquitoes, whatever it is. While other countries, we really hold a lot of global biodiversity and are constantly pushed by saying you have to take care of it, you have to not develop, you have to do this, etc. So the political tension between those different economies that have had vastly different mode of development and use of resources to push for that development means that that creates a lot of political tension as well as interference between different governments to secure that global biodiversity. So all in all, inaction, the reason for inaction really depends on the crisis, where you are, and the socio-economical context that you're faced with. And the last one that I would say is that there is, wherever you are, there is currently a problem in terms of join-up action, which means that you get a department for climate that seems to be really happy with trying to fix the climate crisis. And then somewhere else, you will have a department for nature that try to fix nature. And those stuff don't talk together. And so those different departments sometimes get into competition to try to get the budget from Treasury to do this or to do that. And what we're really missing in any country and then globally is those people to come together and actually design a strategy, a world government strategy for a country where you all agree that you're not going to pull in different directions, but you're going to, all those departments should be concerned by those crises is the point. And they should all join up, have a join up thinking to address it. And that can prevent inaction.
Thanks so much. Billy, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to sort of coming in that from the experience that I've had from seeing that happen from people competing. It's like even within our UK wildlife charities and NGOs, you're just seeing that we're reinventing the wheel at times when we should just be working together. But from an individual sort of perspective, one thing that I just wanted to add was like making all of these things accessible. With the cost of living crisis that we've seen, you know, a lot of people want to implement greener choices into their lifestyles, but just physically can't afford to do it. I mean, sort of, you look at the price of train tickets now, it's just absolutely ridiculous what some of the, you know, I was looking at, I had to get to Scotland a little while ago, and from Stroud, and the train tickets were catastrophic compared to me driving up, you know, and you want to get the train to be more sort of green and sustainable, but you, on your budget, you can't afford to spend 200 quid on a train ticket when it might cost you 40, 50 quid in petrol. So it's, you know, having those things as well. You feel guilty for sometimes trying to look after your bank balance so that you can put food on your table when you want to be helping fight the bigger picture.
Thank you. Yeah, Billy, I think that's a really, well, all the points there are really important, but that thought on how on earth do we reconstruct some of the systems that make it so hard for people. You nipped one of my questions, which was about the cost of living crisis and how can people care about this, and how should we support them to do that when they're undergoing such a huge amount of stress. So thank you, you're a mind reader. I actually have a question for you, Billy, from the audience. Someone asked about your point on how can documentary content and content in general be more bold. What do you mean by that, and what examples can you suggest? You said things need to be bolder.
Yeah, so I think with sort of the landmark series that we've seen, i.e. the Attenborough's Frozen Planet, Planet Earth, and I think Planet Earth 3 is launching at the end of the month, or it's coming out in the next couple of weeks. I think from the snippets and the teasers that I've seen, it is going to be a bit more eye-opening in the sense that, you know, usually when we see these great big glossy blue chip and by blue chip I mean the big fancy stuff, usually, you know, you see the orangutan at the top of the tree and it looks pristine, whereas if that camera operator turn around, it's most likely looking at a palm oil plantation. You know, it's very sort of constrained view that we often get with these sort of wildlife programs, whereas I think what a lot of people are more interested in seeing is the reality of it. And I think what was great from this trailer that we just saw was actually this great big one-horned rhinoceros walking through a street surrounded by people. So I think it's being bolder. Actually, yes, there is definitely a need for wildlife documentaries that are an escape, and they are just, we need those positive stories like we were touching on. It can't all be doom and gloom, but I think we need to be more honest with what the imagery that we're showing to our audiences.
Thank you. Yeah, Robin, did you want to come in on that? Oh, you're on mute.
Good. That okay?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, sorry about that. I mean, I totally agree with that. I mean, it's interesting how it took Attenborough a long time, really, before he began to show some of the negative consequences on wildlife in his programs. I just question how much, it goes back to what I said before, how much negative context can the viewer take If you just had a program that was look at what this awful thing happening to the orangutan or something like that, some of them would turn off. It's a very difficult balance to make how interesting the orangutan's life is versus the threat that it now faces. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just thinking it's a very, very fine line to cross, and I'd be interested to see with the new program, just how well he crosses it, as it were.
Yeah, as a consumer of documentary content rather than a creator, I often find that for me, it's about how do we inspire curiosity in people, because curiosity is the antithesis of paralysis. Like we don't want people to become paralyzed with fear of the doom of it all and the concern around the climate and the biodiversity crisis. What we need is people to be curious about what the solutions are. And so if our content and the way we communicate can do that. Yeah, Billy, Nathalie, go for it.
Let Nathalie go, I'll go after.
Well, it's just a question, really, because all this discussion is based on the assumption that we need to sensibilize more of the public for action to happen. But I don't really believe that. I would remain to be convinced about that, because what I see is a lot of people really, really aware of the emergency and wanting to see change. And actually, polls in the UK shows that people take it very seriously, would like to see change. But then when it comes, for some reason, at least to this point, it doesn't translate into political will and into actual change at the level at which it needs to happen, which is why you get people in the street rioting, because why you have Chris Packham asking whether he should break the law. Mm-hmm. So I think there's also this other side, which is maybe people are relatively aware of things, and what we are missing is how we translate that into the political will to say. And this is why either people are sensible but knows about it and don't vote for it, or we're going to see a reverse and see this change with the next election. But I'm not totally sure that people are not aware, or that they don't see this as an emergency. All the polls I've seen shows that actually people are really aware and concerned.
Yeah, it's
I think the cost of living issue is an issue with it, though. They may feel very concerned, but if they can't afford to take action, then that's them stuck, isn't it?
Except that there are government solutions to cost of living. Look at Germany; they have completely rethought their transport system, creating a ticket for wherever you go in the country. At some point, you were paying €49 to move for a whole month or 2 months in the country. So there are government-based solutions to this. This shouldn't feel like it's the people's responsibility that you shouldn't push vulnerable people to feel guilty about not being able to safeguard the environment. The real responsibility always falls on government on this one, and on not putting together a solution that does decrease that impact on our environment.
That makes the assumption you've got a responsible government, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, but we should demand that. I don't think we should do anything else than demanding that.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting discussion, and something that I think about a lot in regards to how do we not only ensure that policy is science informed and science led, but how we make sure it's implemented and that we're doing it, and that. Because Nathalie's right, the polling does suggest that people are deeply concerned and deeply care, but they also need to be given the ways of acting, and that's where policy comes in. It's giving people those levers to make those changes in a way that isn't incredibly burdensome on their lives.
It goes back to what I was saying before. You have to have a feeling of hope. I can take action, and it gives me a chance and a hope that I will be able to put things right. Yeah. And if you don't feel that hope, then it's a bit tricky.
We've got about 15 minutes left, and there are lots of questions in the chat. Please keep them coming. I have one that I want to direct towards Nathalie, but others are welcome to comment. Sarah Lowe asks, what happens to conservation policy when the climate crisis starts affecting key elements for human survival, such as food production? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so I think that this is already being discussed by the Climate Change Committee in the UK, for example, and global scientific consensus is that we're going to need to think about what we eat a little bit more deeply, and any kind of transition to a carbon neutral, etc., does factor in a change in diet. That's the scientific evidence. So then we need to talk about cultural change and a way to think differently about food. But I don't think I'm hoping we're not going to wait to the absolute disaster of climate change to then suddenly think as to whether we should still do conservation. The point of this is that there is no human well-being and human life without other species. There is no planet where we live on our own and we depend on nothing else than just us. We can't afford losing nature. It's not as if it's a luxury to do conservation. It's literally underpin our existence. Anything that we need, from habitat to food to any kind of services that we need, is provided by nature. So it's not a neither nor. It's not a luxury. We can't just we can't just trash that. We're gonna have to do both, and so we're gonna need to think as to how we do that, and that means transformative change. I think any kind of committee, any kind of scientist has been really clear on this. I know that the politics are always trying to say no, it's not as this or as that, but we do need to change how we have been living, especially in the global north.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? Cool. Oh, another question. This one to everyone, but maybe to Billy, based on your work you've seen in the field, and to Nathalie as well. An anonymous question answer. We know that conservation works. Can someone share an example of a solution that's addressing both the biodiversity and the conservation crisis? So what's working, and how can we do more of it? Billy, Nathalie?
I was going to jump in and just show some of, with beaver reintroductions, the sort of success that and the sort of impacts that beaver reintroduction, some of the pilot projects, and now we're seeing completely wild reintroductions that will be taking place. But the benefits that we can see from creating wetlands and increasing biodiversity, as well as carbon sequestration within beaver, what a giant rodent can do for us. It's like, from my experience working within a wildlife trust, the amount of people that go out, our nature-based solutions team would go out and effectively pretend to be beavers during the day by creating leaky dam structures and, doing all these things in our watercourses in the Cotswolds, which beavers can do for us. So, and we have quite a lot of beavers now that have been reintroduced into the UK, but there's still obviously conflict at either side of the fence with this, but that's a nature-based solution that wildlife does all these things for us, and we've seen the success.
Amazing, thank you. Nathalie, anything from you?
Yeah, well, another one that is not UK based, sorry people, but is one that I'm quite fond of, because it's an ecosystem that is not as loved as it should be, but it's mangroves. Mangrove restoration. Nobody seems to realize that mangroves are nurseries for fisheries. So without mangrove, fish stock goes boom. So mangrove restoration is not only important for fish, but it's also one of the ecosystems that store among the most rapidly and the most amount of carbon. So mangrove restoration feeds people and capture carbon, mitigating the impact of climate change. And on top of that, those mangrove protect communities that live nearby from surge and storms. So this is a great example of how conservation work and how it delivers for addressing the climate change and the biodiversity crisis.
Thank you. Anything from you, Robin, before we move on to the next question?
Can I throw in the Iberian lynx, which is one of my favorites?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Fantastic study down in south of Spain, reintroduced a predator that was on its way out. They're about twice the size of tabby cats and 4 times as vicious. And they were being hunted to extinction, and along came people and said, look, this is the region's animal. And they pumped a lot of money in it, and from something like 40 animals, the last time I looked, there was about 400. And it's an iconic species, literally. I mean, that is the symbol of the region, is the lynx. So, it's something to be, something to admire.
Amazing, thank you. I think we've got time for a couple more, and I've got two in mind. The first is a question about sort of conservation and green jobs in general. We've had two questions that I thought would be good to combine. The first is around how there's a real lack of diversity within the conservation sector and within the environmental sector in general, and then how we need to tackle that. And the second question from a different question asker was around the fact that a lot of green jobs are really poorly paid, and that and the non-profit sector is often less paid. And is this leading to a lack of action on biodiversity and climate? So that question around diversity and that question around, like, you know, fair pay for people is absolutely central. I mean, from my perspective, I think it's a very good point. Like, there's a real reason, it's a real blocker to people wanting to enter a sector. Obviously, all the will in the world and all the desire to improve the world is super, super important, but also you need to have a living wage that is livable and fair. And as for diversity as well, like, conservation is a renowned sector for having a lack of diversity, and there's a huge amount of work. And I mean, I'm talking as a white person to an all-white panel. Like, there's a lot of work to be done. So there's some thoughts from me, but eager to throw it out to Billy as well, because there's lots of questions on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind just jumping in to start with, like, having worked for a wildlife charity and having recently left it for that reason, to be honest, was, you know, the salary wasn't competitive. And, you know, at a point where I'm trying to save for a house deposit and, you know, and cost of living and everything. One of the reasons I left the job that I was in, my day job, was because I wasn't getting paid enough. And I've managed to find a job that is slightly better paid but I haven't started it yet. But again, we did a survey within the sort of, you know, from 50 to 60 members of staff, and, you know, the diversity was virtually none, and that was working with a wildlife charity. So no, it's definitely an issue. You know, we tried, part of my job working with the comms was to sort of reach out to sort of new audiences within the Gloucestershire, and, you know, Gloucester is a very diverse area, but it was just, and a lot of the outreach that the Wildlife Trust do in this area is outreach with schools within Gloucester and urban environments. So getting into schools early with primary education is great, but what I was struggling to tap into was that 15 to 25 age gap, to increase diversity and sort of awareness of conservation in this county. But I've definitely seen an improvement in, like, primary education and sort of the outreach there, but it was very hard to sort of see it happening within secondary education.
My turn to be on mute. Amazing, thank you. Any other points on that? Otherwise, we've got a couple more I want to try and squeeze in. Nathalie, go on.
Maybe just one on top of all of this, which I very much agree. But I think there's one thing that I want to make it clear, is that there is a difference between a green job and conservation jobs. And actually, there's a lot of green jobs. There is a green job in transport. There's a green job in housing. There is a green job. There's a lot. Ideally, what you want is that everybody start to have a green job, where you start to think on how you do and how that promotes a more sustainable environment. And so I know we had some discussions some months ago about what's a conservationist at ZSL and so on. And actually, everyone is a conservationist, because there are different, as it's not, nature recovery doesn't work unless you have a whole society approach to nature recovery. And so that's one way of engaging the diversity of people, by showing that their skills matter for establishing a sustainable society. We don't just need zoologists, although, and I want to see more diversity there, but we also need engineers that think differently about how to build a sustainable work, financing people that start to think about doing different way of doing financing, housing people that think about how to bring biodiversity within architecture. That's the kind of thing that would also increase diversity somehow, to really start to connect all those spheres of society that matter for a sustainable future.
Thank you. Yeah, at that point on all jobs should be green jobs, isn't it? Absolutely, like, what a thing to aim for across policy, across education, across everything. Thank you. I have, I think we can sneak in one last question and then an extra little one just to kick us off, just to finish us off. Really good question from Mike Yervios, sorry if I've mispronounced your name, Mike. We've heard a lot about the role of governments, but what role do NGOs have in helping speed up the implementation of these agreements? So yeah, I'll open it up to everyone because I think we probably all speak to it. Maybe just to be cruel, Billy, do you want to kick us off? Think about what NGOs are.
So definitely helping with like raising awareness. I mean, we'll talk about social media with this one, and then I'm sure Rob might have some things to say about obviously social media and stuff, because it's a love-hate of mine for sure. But you know, most people have got one of the can't see my iPhone. There it is. Most people have a smart device now, so you know, have the technology at their fingertips to have a say and to sort of join in with citizen science campaigns or social media collaborations. You know, this week it's National Mammal Week. So I've been doing some work with the Mammal Society. So this year it's all about mammal connectedness, talking about how people interact with mammals in their daily life, whether that's watching a fox raid your bin or you've got badgers coming into your garden at night, you know. So I think, and that's a big role of NGOs and wildlife charities, is yes, they need to do the lobbying and getting petitions sent into Downing Street, which is something I've just done with Whale and Dolphin Conservation, but it's also getting people to interact and share their stories and get involved and just have their say and raise awareness and inspire other people as well, and teaming up with the voices of NGOs.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I think it might be important to realize that there are different types of NGO within the conservation community. So some are really good at linking up with local authorities or implementing local projects. Some are more into providing science evidence or using convening power to advance policy. Some might be more into providing evidence to inform international efforts. So there's a variety of NGO within the conservation sector that have different roles. And I think one thing that they do well, though, is to make sure that the environmental agenda is never forgotten, and then really respond to all those government inquiries, those data deficiency, building capacity, really advancing those big political idea or political decision into implementation. There are those non-state actor that feeds into those action agenda, which are supported by a UN convention. So they are really important into driving those efforts, but also into making sure that governments stay accountable on some of their decision and policies. So the roles are diverse, and it depends a bit on who you're talking to and which NGO they work into. But definitely they have a huge role, which is increasingly recognized by government and UN conventions.
Thank you. Yeah, I think something I observe as someone who's worked in the charity sector for a while is that there's often a huge amount of attention on like the passing of legislation and the creation of legislation, both domestically and internationally, and then there's less attention on the implementation. And I think that's shifting now, which is really, really interesting and really important, especially organizations like ZSL and the Wildlife Trust and others are all thinking about implementation. But it's really sexy to be able to say, oh yeah, we helped pass this law, but the hard work is in making it a reality. The law is absolutely essential, but so is this implementation. I am gonna, Robin, unless you want to add anything to that, I'm gonna close us with one final question. But Robin, cool. All right. So there's been, thank you so much to all the audience questions. They're all amazing. And I'm sorry we haven't been able to get through all of them. But there has been a few about what can local people do and what's the role of individuals. I'm just going to read a comment that Monica wrote because I think it's lovely. Community-based organisations and communities can be empowered. Politicians come and go, but local residents can be consistent. In many of the projects that we're doing at ZSL, we increasingly measure success through senses of well-being, knowledge, and empowerment. So local community knowledge sharing can be really, really powerful. I thought it was a lovely comment, so I wanted to give it a platform. But I'm going to use that to end us on a final question, which is, we've spoken about the global and we've spoken about the need for systemic change. But the people on this call, what the viewers, what should they take away as actions that they can take? Yeah, and what can the average citizen do? So yeah, we'll do quick fire. I went to Nathalie at the beginning, so Robin, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, I'll just go back to what I said before. Don't give up hope. We can do it. We will do it. I think it's just how quickly we do it, and do not let the politicians off with it. Make sure your local councils know what they're doing, and yeah, action at the ground root couldn't be better. Yeah, and wildlife trusts particularly, I think, have a really great role to play in these things. I'm, a member of Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, so and kind of lead they do is fantastic. So yeah,
amazing. Billy?
Yeah, just following on from that is sort of start small, get involved with your local charity and organisations, whether it's bat survey group, badger champions, which badger trust are going to be sort of rallying out, as well as all the wildlife trust and local bird groups. But yeah, volunteer, donate to your local wildlife charities, and then get involved with, I mentioned citizen science earlier, there's so many different apps. If you're out on a walk now, if you see something with iMapper, Mammal Web, there's so many different apps now, and there's links on ZSL's page as well, and you've got your own sort of citizen science app as well, is recording your local wildlife so we know where it is. And then some of the other things about, don't use single-use plastics, shop locally, go shop organically, travel responsibly. If you but then obviously then you've got the affordability of that as well. But then it's putting all these things into your garden if you've got one, or onto your balcony. Start small.
Amazing. Nathalie, go ahead.
Well, given all of what they've said, I agree with all of that. And maybe I would add, talk about it. Because one thing that makes a lot of difference is talking to your neighbors, the school parents, anyone about that, and make the case that this is important. See how they relate. See what how they feel about it. Because the more we talk about it, the more you're gonna build that pressure on government. The other stuff that I would say is that if we continue on that red thread that every job should be a green job, then start to think about how you can add your skill to the mix. Because I think what I see in science, that I get approached with a lot of students that say, well, I'm not doing this, I'm not a wildlife specialist and stuff, but I do that. I do models, I do architecture, I do whatever. I'm a geographer, I'm an engineer, and I'm really interested in helping with the nature recovery program and addressing biodiversity. How can I help? And I think that is exactly the way to think about this. How do we start to get all those different, in science community, all those different science, but in society, those different community start to see how they can help while doing what Robin has said, because I think that's the key thing, is to systematically demand better, but also to try to see how we can permeate that agenda across society, so that it shouldn't be the standard of conservation biologists. It should be the standard of every voter. It should be that kind of stuff. And as long as the problems stay associated with conservation biologists, we're going to go nowhere. We really need to make it a whole society problem and a whole society solution.
Beautiful. I can't outdo that. So that's amazing. Thank you so much. I think that topic throughout this conversation, topics of hope, topics of using your political voice and voting, and voting with your money as well, has come up again and again, and also using your skills. People in the chat are talking about how they want to work in this world and in working for a better planet, and that's unbelievably encouraging and lovely. But that job of every job should be a green job, I think is so important and an exciting thing to try and take out with us. I am going to bring us to a close. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists. I'm so grateful for your time and your energy and your enthusiasm. Thank you again to everybody for your time and your wonderful questions. And yeah, just encouraged to please go about your evening and feel that you can bring some of that hope with you. Thanks so much. Bye.